Welcome to Careers in Discovery, your window into the world of biotech leaders. On each episode, we interview the industry's leading executives to understand how they built their careers, what they've learned along the way, and the advice they'd give to their younger selves. Maude Tessier is the Chief Business Officer at Seismic Therapeutic, the machine learning immunology company who are building a discovery platform centered on parallel drug development. Maude joined us to talk about the impact of machine learning on drug development, taking control of her career by literally knocking on doors, balancing humility and confidence, and a whole lot more. So we're back on Careers in Discovery, and this week I'm joined by Maude Tessier of Seismic Therapeutic. Maude, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Oh, it's fantastic to see you. And Maude, I'm really excited to explore your career and talk about business development and science and machine learning and all the things that you've been involved in along the way. We always start by talking a little bit about what you're up to now. And I'm really excited to learn more about Seismic Therapeutic and how you summarize yourselves as the machine learning immunology company. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about that.
Absolutely. So Seismic Therapeutic, we're a preclinical immunology company based in Boston. We use machine learning to discover and develop novel protein therapeutics, both enzymes and antibodies for the treatment of autoimmune disease. Yeah. And we currently have 2 programs in IND-enabling studies. So we're almost in the clinic, which will be an exciting milestone for us as a company. And we really, these 2 lead programs are novel approaches to validated targets in the autoimmunity space. Yes. So one of the 2 lead programs is a pan-IgG protease that we designed using machine learning. So it's an enzyme that cleaves the autoantibodies that are responsible for autoimmune diseases like myasthenia gravis that you may have heard of through Argenx and other companies that have made quite the splash in the last few years. The other lead program that we have is a PD-1 agonist. So a lot of folks have heard about the PD-1 antagonist space in the oncology realm. So this is looking at the other side of the coin. And in this program, we have an antibody that allows us to essentially engage both the T cell and the B cell side of the immune synapse. And we believe that's going to be meaningful for a number of T cell mediated autoimmune disease like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and other indications. So very exciting time for us as a company. Absolutely.
And what has been the sort of the difference that machine learning has made for you in your development as and the development of your programs?
So machine learning is a really exciting field. Of course, it's exploded in the last few years. When Seismic got started in 2021, most of the companies that were involved in machine learning and drug discovery were using AI for the purpose of identifying or validating molecular targets, or they were using it for small molecule drug discovery. And so Seismic, we were one of the first wave of companies that were solely applying machine learning to biologics drug development. And so the way we're using it here at Seismic is that we are integrating machine learning with structural biology, translational immunology, and protein engineering. And machine learning allows us to essentially optimize multiple parameters at once in parallel in order to get to a final drug candidate much more quickly than in traditional means. So with biologics drug discovery, typically you would make one mutation at a time to start from, let's say, an existing natural occurring enzyme or an existing antibody. And with each mutation, then test it in the lab and figure out what the effect of that mutation is. What machine learning allows us to do is to make multiple mutations in a single cycle and looking at the effect of all these mutations on various parameters like the stability of the molecule, the function of the molecule, as well as the immunogenicity of the molecule. And so machine learning is really a helpful tool because it allows us to better understand the relationships that exist between the various amino acids that form a protein. And so we can essentially change many of the different parameters that a protein needs to have to be more of a drug and we can get there much more quickly. Our first two lead programs went from discovery to development candidate in 18 months, which is about half of what it normally takes.
Absolutely.
And in particular, here at Seismic, one of the key parameters that we've really have gone beyond state of the art with machine learning is around this immunogenicity component. So as you may know,
Okay.
as different proteins are engineered, it can create an immune response in the host because it's seen as a foreign entity. And so we've been able here at Seismic using machine learning to be able to predict both the T and the B cell epitopes within proteins and be able to remove them while still keeping the stability and the function of the protein. And so that's I think a key element of how we've used machine learning in a different way than others have so far.
Yeah, very interesting. And as you say, that's rapid progress. But also, I suppose, being efficient with your programs, that's allowed you to advance two programs at the same time rather than having to pick one and bet on just the one.
Absolutely. Yeah, we over delivered on what we were looking to achieve. And, Seismic really got started around a concept of applying machine learning to biologics. And a big portion of our team here at Seismic is have a track record in the immunology drug development space. And so that's where we're starting to
Mm,
develop drugs in the autoimmune disease area. And obviously with time that may broaden, but
yes.
that's where we're starting. And I think these two areas that we've picked to start with are really novel approaches to autoimmune disease validated targets. And so I think it's also allowing us to really clearly have examples of how we've used machine learning
Yes.
and have those as case studies and proof of principles of how AI can help with drug development, which, for us, I think was really important as a company to be able to, crystallize for our audience, which obviously in my case are mostly investors and pharma companies,
Hmm.
about how we've used machine learning and how helpful it can actually be.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads me nicely to my next question about your role in the company, Maud. And as the chief business officer in this kind of company, um, I'm assuming that you're looking quite far ahead in the development of the business and developing those relationships for partnerships, licensing deals, that kind of stuff further down the line. But tell me a bit about where your focus is.
Yeah, so currently at Seismic, we have about 50 people. So we're
Hmm.
still a fairly small company. And as I mentioned, we're about 3 years old. And so, as the chief business officer, I really sit as this intersection of science and business, which is what I really enjoy about my role.
Yes.
And I'm accountable for strategizing around the financing and the partnering strategy for the company, and of course, executing on the strategy once we've set it. And also building a number of business functions, including business development, but not limited to business
Okay.
development. As I'm sure you've covered with others in your podcast, when you're a CBO of a small company, you get to wear many hats. And my team at Seismic is really a incubation center, as I like to say, for a number of business functions. And so currently, in addition to the financing and the partnering, I'm also responsible for corporate communications, investor relations, as well as IP and contracts. And so
Okay.
it's still a fairly broad remit. And fortunately for me, I have two talented team members, and collectively we wear all these hats. And with time, I think there's always this organic evolution when eventually we'll hire some experts who can take over some of these functions for us. Some of these team members may kind of butt off and become their own leaders and
Yes.
their own teams with time. And so that's always a nice moment where we get to that stage as a company. And so for us, I think that's been the key remit of the CBO role here at Seismic.
Yeah, fantastic. And that blend of science and business and science and the commercial side of things is what really excites you, you mentioned. And I want to come back to that as we talk about your career. But we always like to go right back to the beginning to start with. And I'd love to understand, of course, you're a molecular biologist by training and did your PhD at Toronto in molecular biology of cancer. Tell us a bit about, for you, why science, first of all, and why biology, why drug development? Where are the origins of this career for you?
So I started really my career, as you pointed out, in the biochemistry biology
Mm,
space. And growing up in a small town outside of Montreal, my dad was a teacher. He was also a university professor, and he did a PhD in his 40s in humanities
Hmm.
while he was working full time. And my mom worked at a hospital. She was an imaging tech at a local hospital. And so I remember being a kid and kind of hearing my mom's kind of day when she got back home
Right.
about all the interesting kind of medical cases that she's seen. And I would say this is when I got to know a little bit more around the life science track and how my original interest in that space probably started. And my dad was the only person I knew who had a PhD at the time.
Yeah.
And so, for me, I think this was my inspiration, I would say, probably looking back to, combine this love of science and this love of medical science in particular with, wanting to do a graduate degree in that
Hmm.
that area. And at the time, I didn't really know that it was going to, lead to a career in drug development. I really thought that I was
Right.
going to continue on the academic track and be a scientist and be a principal investigator and have my own lab. That's what I thought at the time. And obviously things have turned out differently in a good way.
Sure.
But that was my original goal by doing a graduate program, was to become a scientist full time.
Yeah, interesting. And as you say, things took a different turn at some point, and you finished up your PhD and found yourself straight into the sort of business development, commercial side of the industry. I'm really interested about how that happened, what drew your attention to that sort of things, and how you ended up there.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was finishing my PhD, probably a year after I finished, I was thinking that I loved science and wanted to still be closely involved with the science, but did not want to be in the lab. And so I
Right.
went on a bit of a career exploration back in Toronto where I was very proactive and just trying to find my own way. And that was very intimidating at the time because
Hmm.
this was early 2000, not to date myself, but that was about 20 years ago.
Sure.
And and so things were different back then, especially in Canada, where things aren't quite the same as here in Boston from a life science and entrepreneurship standpoint. So I really had to kind of put myself out there. And I started by having a lot of informational interviews with various people who had found their path, if you will, by having had a
Mm.
PhD, but by doing something different. I ended up doing an internship at the tech transfer office where I was a student. I ended up taking a few MBA classes, not a full MBA, but a few classes here and there.
Yeah.
Um, and eventually find my way to wanting to do business development and licensing, partly because of the interdisciplinary nature of the work, and because it was much more an outward facing role where one could
Right.
see, the impact of the work,
Yes.
especially with obviously our goal of helping patients. And so while this was going on, I knew I was going to move to Boston as well. So I met my husband in graduate school.
Hmm.
he was already here in Boston doing a postdoc, so I knew that was in the cards. And so when I arrived here in Boston, I think the challenge was that one, I was trying to make this transition without knowing anyone except my
Right.
significant other. And of course, I had no real business development experience to
Mm.
speak of. And so what I ended up doing is essentially knocking on doors. So I printed out my resume and walked around Cambridge here in Massachusetts, and essentially showed up unannounced at a number of small
Okay.
oncology companies.
Yeah.
And my strategy was to say, well, I'm trained as a scientist. I'm willing to work on the bench for a little bit, but my ultimate goal is to do business development and would love at least the opportunity of perhaps working on some business development projects on the side. And so, and my pitch worked even better than I thought because a few days after I showed up at a small company that was called Xanthus Pharmaceuticals, somebody called me back and said that the chief business officer was looking for a junior business development person that had a scientific background in oncology. And he was really, I think, keen on being a mentor.
Yes.
And he wanted me to come in and interview. And that's essentially how I got my first business development role.
Yeah.
And so definitely some of it is, showing up at the right place at the right time. But I think, there's definitely a lesson there about being proactive with one's career.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, sometimes, as you say, it can be a bit of a catch-22 that, you need the deal sheet to get into BD, but you need the job to get the deal sheet, and people have to sometimes find a way around that, right? And I think what's interesting is that, yes, okay, there's an element of serendipity in the story, but you put yourself in a position where that serendipity could happen, right? And I'm sure it wasn't just the one company that you went and dropped your resume off at. And I think, you know, a lot of people would hesitate to do that because they would be worried about being embarrassed or imposing on people, or whatever it might be. But I think as someone who's sort of run sales teams and done a lot of business development, you'd see that as a really positive attribute for someone coming into a junior role, I think.
Right. I do think my boldness reflected well
Mm,
in the
absolutely.
long run, right? Because obviously I wasn't going to take no for an answer, and I was really committed to making this happen. And for me, I think that was a way of trying to accelerate it a little bit. I do
Yeah.
think with time it probably would have happened, right, as I built my network more and more here in Boston, but it probably would have taken me months, and I'm not a patient person in general.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But I think, you'd moved to a new city. Obviously, biotech hotbed, so there was clearly opportunity there, but a new city nonetheless, and where you didn't really know anyone, as you said. The sort of the the simple thing to do, the easy thing to do would have been to see if you could do a postdoc, or to go and work in the lab somewhere, or to sort of quietly work your way in and maybe harbor this ambition of getting into business development, but put it to one side for a while. And you seem very clear as you tell that story that you knew where you wanted to go with it, though, and that BD was the route for you. Where did that come from, and why was that such a clear goal for you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in the last, year after I graduated from well, before I graduated from my PhD, while I was kind of finishing up experiments and writing up my thesis, this is when I kind of explored a number of different career paths. I read a really great book, which I'm assuming is still on Amazon somewhere, called Leaving the Ivory Tower.
Okay.
And it was one of these books where each chapter was essentially a personal story of someone that had a PhD but ended up doing a quote unquote alternative career in science.
Yes.
And that book was very helpful. And that was a time where, again, I had no role model to really model myself in. So
Mm,
I think for me, this book was really helpful in at least kind of narrowing down what sounded interesting to me and perhaps was less interesting. And then from there, it was really about cold calling, cold emailing people within the Toronto area at the time. And, one of the lessons that I've learned is that people love talking about what they do for a living,
yes, they do.
which is all why we're here on this podcast.
Absolutely.
And the vast majority of people were very generous with their time
Yeah.
and their advice, and very, I think, also kind in wanting to help, somebody that was trying to find their way. And, for me, I think that was also a turning point in the sense that now that's also why I want to give back and continue to nurture this next generation of business leaders, because,
Mm,
somebody did it for me at the time where I really needed it. And, those informational interviews were really helpful to kind of narrow down the path towards business development and licensing. And I just thought that that was the kind of path that would really keep me fulfilled and entertained,
yeah. Yeah.
for the rest of my working life. The fact that it's a demanding role because you need to know a lot about a lot of different disciplines. I think science is the start of it for
Mm,
me, but you need to know about intellectual property, you need to understand contracts, you need to be able to negotiate. There's obviously a lot of marketing involved. How do you present the story to various audiences? And there's obviously a lot of soft skills involved
mhm.
around how do you persuade someone? How do you influence someone? And so for me, I think it was really exciting to have sort of the kind of career path that for somebody as curious as me, I think would really keep me fulfilled and challenged. And almost 20 years later, it certainly has not disappointed.
No, I'm sure, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about how that unfolded. I guess the one thing I just wanted to ask before we moved on was about the strategy that you took and the sort of the decision to do that, because I think, again, a lot of people would just apply for some jobs, and if they didn't get them, would sort of go, okay, well, I guess I didn't get them. Whereas, you decided that there was a different approach to take. What do you remember? I know we're going back a while now, but do you remember like when you decided to do that and why you made that decision? What was it, just an obvious thing to you, or how did that come about, do you think?
Yeah, I don't remember having had a lot of dilemma about this. I
Okay,
was
fair
sort of
enough.
like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I did try the traditional route,
Yeah.
right? I did try to sort of apply for roles as they were posted online, just sending my resume in, right? Filling out whatever portal you needed to fill out. And it was pretty clear to me that probably a month or so into that strategy that was not going to work.
I see. Okay.
So I would say that was the first kind of hint that maybe I needed to do something maybe a bit more extreme
Mm-hmm.
in order to get what I was looking for. As I described earlier, I did have a bit of a sales pitch that I was flexible and was
Yes.
okay with having perhaps a bit more of a hybrid role at first, because I think was humble enough to understand that maybe I didn't have the background I needed yet, and I was going to have to be very lucky to find someone, my first business development mentor, who I think saw something in me and was
Yes.
willing to train me from the ground up. And so I think that was the other key element that I think it's very important to find early on in one's career, especially if you're trying to make as big of a jump as what I was trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so I'm conscious we're still very much at the beginning of your career. So you joined Xanthus, learned your craft there, and then progressed through your BD career. Tell us a little bit about where it went from there, and I guess as well, it sounds like a lot of the softer skills that you needed came naturally to you. But of course, you want to develop them and you want to refine them and you want to get better at the things you were really good at. So tell us a bit about your growth as a business development professional.
So I would say this transition from science to BD was the first phase looking back
Right.
that I've had in my career. And I would say that since then, I've been able to kind of look at two other phases. I think the phase after that, which probably took a good decade, was around, as you described, developing these core business development and related skills. And I didn't have a very well defined career plan.
Mm,
I sort of, just thought that this was an interesting path for me that was going to leverage a lot of my natural abilities and my love for science and my
yes.
passion for helping patients. And I was fortunate enough that along this 10-year decade, or so, I was able to essentially own my skills in very different environments. So I worked in a small biotech called Xanthus, as you mentioned. Then I went to an academic medical center. So I worked on the academic side at Boston Children's Hospital for a number of
Hmm.
years doing IP, licensing, alliance management. That's when I became a manager for the first time, did a lot of
Yes.
deals while I was there. So a very formative time. And then after that, went to a large pharma company.
Hmm.
And this was a time too, I went at Merck, the American Merck, here in Boston, and had a job in search and evaluation. So they paid me to learn about science every day for, 4 years. So that was
Yeah.
terrific, just meeting with a lot of very talented young companies and essentially trying to do a number of deals in that space to bring interesting scientific programs and novel drugs into the marketplace with the support of Merck. And that was a wonderful time as well. I think I learned a lot about how large pharma companies do deals, how decisions are being made, how diligence is conducted. And I think this is also where a lot of the soft skills came into play, because as
Right.
much as, the large pharma side is considered the quote unquote buy side of our industry,
Hmm.
I would say that there's a lot of selling that happens behind the
Right.
scenes. You have to convince everyone internally that the deal that you're working on and the program that you're excited about is worth investing time and effort. And there's a lot of other programs you have to compete with when you're
Yeah.
making that pitch. And so for me, I think my time at Merck was also, I think, looking back, a very formative time. And so, after this kind of 10-year phase in academia, biotech, and pharma, I was fortunate enough to think of, what's the area that for me makes the most sense to continue in. And after exploring that, I felt like being a small company executive was probably where my sweet spot was.
Okay.
I've enjoyed my time in these other settings. And as I've mentioned, I've learned something meaningful in every role I've had. And I've met
Yes.
terrific people along the way that I'm still in contact with. But I really felt like being in a small company was the best path for me going forward. And so after this 10-year exploration, if you will, of BD in different environments, decided to focus on the biotech side. And I would say that's probably to date, the third phase of my career. I'm in my mid 40s, so hopefully there's more phases to come. But
Absolutely.
the third phase that I'm in now has really been to kind of transition from an individual contributor in business development to being a C-level executive in a small
Hmm.
biotech. And that's been an interesting transition as well. So I've been now a two-time CBO.
Yeah.
So before Seismic, I was the chief business officer of Ikena Oncology, which is a publicly traded oncology company here in the Boston area. And I joined them shortly after the Series A closed, and I was, I believe, employee number 13.
Okay.
And lucky 13, hopefully. And I stayed there until 1 year after we went public. So during that time, we underwent a lot of changes. There were a lot of ups and downs and twists and turns in our journey as a company. We became a clinical company. I did a very large Celgene deal, one of the last Celgene deals.
Right.
Then obviously worked with BMS, and there's a story there that we might get to eventually as well. And, we bought a small company. We rebranded the company from Kind Therapeutics, which was its original name, to Ikena. Went public during the pandemic, which was an experience in itself. Started out as a team of one, left when I had a team of six. So that was, I think, a very formative time for me, because I've realized that as much as I started out my career as a BD executive, now I see
Mm.
myself as a company builder first
Yes.
and foremost. Business development is now, an important facet, but only one facet of what I do here at Seismic and what I did at Akena.
Yeah.
And partnering is a core element of growing a successful company. But I would say my remit, because of that, I think has grown significantly in my interest after leaving Ikena to essentially do the cycle again, hopefully, here at Seismic was part of that bug, if you will. I think
Hmm.
for me, the opportunity to grow an organization and have the common goal of helping patients with a group of really talented scientists and talented business leaders has, I would say, no comparison in any other field. I
Yes.
think that's something that we're really fortunate to be able to do here in biotech.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the collaborative nature of the sector is really unique, and it's great to be able to um just, I mean, there's so much fascinating science around, right? It's great to be able to see it and hear it and support it and partner with companies who are doing amazing things. I feel like I've got to ask you about the Celgene deal now. Um,
Well, this brings us, I think, also to maybe something I've learned along the way about
yes,
what it takes to be a successful business development
fantastic.
executive, which is adaptability and resilience.
Mm,
Because, of course, in a small biotech, as I just described with our story at Ikena, for instance, the companies go through quite a few chapters, and the ability of an executive to stay with said company for a certain amount of time is sort of almost directly tied to how flexible and adaptable someone could be.
yes, of course.
Every 6 months, I sort of felt like my role was very different at Ikena, because again of this just maturation and growth of the company. And I think it also takes a lot of adaptability and resilience when surprises arise.
Right.
And in this case, the Celgene deal was an interesting one because we were essentially parallel tracking. This was back in 2018 to set the stage. So this was a while ago. And we were parallel tracking a Series B discussion with potential partnering discussions.
Okay.
And at the time, I was a team of one. So it was me and the CEO, and everybody else was in R&D.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually we had interest from both sides, and we decided to put, our eggs in the partnering basket
Mm.
for a number of reasons. One is that we probably knew we wanted to pivot from an R&D standpoint, and so that afforded us the opportunity of essentially finding a home for two of our assets, and bringing in significant non-dilutive capital into the company in a way that the Series B would not have been able to
Absolutely.
provide
Yeah.
for us at that time. So we picked the partnering path, and Celgene was the company that we were furthest along with, and eventually ended up discussing with them exclusively. And it was a pretty fast deal process. It was 6 weeks, over the holidays. And so, everybody was hard at work. And the day before we were to sign the deal, this is when the Celgene acquisition by BMS was announced.
I see. Okay.
And so, to this day, I would say that week that started on that fateful Thursday through the Friday that followed is probably, the toughest one that I've had in
Yeah.
my BD career. As a small company, we were highly dependent on getting this deal done in
Of
order
course.
to have a long-term viability. We had picked that one path as I described, and so we were fully committed to it, and didn't have a whole lot of other options at that
Mm-hmm.
point, at least near term, right? I'm sure longer term we could have maybe figured it out and
Yeah.
gone back to some of our Series B potential investors, but we were far down the path, and there was a lot of pressure to getting this deal done. And so for me, I think this is one where, being able to have a cool head during that time was very important. Obviously, there was a lot of panic when the news came in, and we were getting, pinged by the board about what does that mean for us? Is the deal still on? Is it not on? So it was definitely a very, I'd say, it was stressful week. And then the other kind of wrinkle is that, JP Morgan, right, the healthcare conference in San Francisco in January was starting that Monday.
Oh,
And
okay.
so, we had originally planned that our deal was going to get announced, and we
Mm-hmm.
were going to have a celebratory time in San Francisco. And instead, my whole week was, of course, upended by,
Yes.
trying to close this deal as fast as possible, and making sure that we still had enough enthusiasm on the Celgene/BMS side to get that deal done after all. And that
Yeah.
brought in $100 million into the company. And so that was a significant deal. That was just the upfront for us to really support the
Wow.
company for multiple years going forward. And so that time I was on the right side of that situation, and that our deal got done, thank goodness. But yeah, I think being able to think on your feet, being able to, keep yourself within a certain emotional range is pretty
Mm.
important. You can't kind of be too excited or too negative. I think trying to be sort of in this middle ground that allows you to be productive even in times of high stress is definitely something that I've learned during that particular episode, but definitely a thing
Yes.
that I've taken with me for all the deals that I've done.
Yeah, and I was interested to ask you about that, about how you react to that situation. So, you've been working hard on this deal for a long time. You've kind of not maybe burnt your other bridges, but you've made those paths more difficult to go back to commit to this. I'm assuming they hadn't said anything about their situation because you don't, right? And suddenly this news gets announced, and not only does it put the deal in jeopardy, but I suppose everything you've learned about who the decision makers are, who the influencers are, what the financial status of the company is, what they're interested in, all this kind of stuff could potentially all be out the window, and it could be a completely different a different scenario. Okay, what do you do when that happens?
I mean, I think the first thing we did is, of course, call our current contacts at
Sure.
Celgene. And I have to say, the team that was there at the time, Rob Hirschberg, who was the former CSO and had just joined as the head of their business development team, was very good at making sure that we had open lines of communication, in particular that first day when the deal had just been announced, the merger had just been announced. And so that was definitely the first key part, is to get, a clearer understanding of the process going forward, how much our deal had been discussed or not discussed, what the likelihood was that we could get it done. And I think we were fortunate in this particular case that, when BMS acquired Celgene, quite a few members of the Celgene R&D team stayed on.
Right, yes.
And so because of that, there was actually quite a good level of continuity. And that became clear in the days that followed, that the folks that we had who were true advocates for us at Akena and were really the champions of this deal and believed in our science, the vast majority of them were going to stay on. And actually, quite a few members of the diligence team that had looked at the program and ended up being involved in the program longer term and being part of our joint steering committee. So the continuity on the R&D side was there for sure. On the BD side, a lot less, right? Once the acquisition went through, obviously some of those teams kind of got recycled. But on the R&D side, I think we were pretty fortunate that was something that worked in our favor.
Yeah.
And I think good communication with our board was also really important, because there was a lot of discussions around, well, is it a good thing that BMS is not in the picture? And, the short answer was yes. I think we felt like that was for us longer term, I think a good thing to have BMS as our partner. I think Celgene would have been terrific as well, but there was definitely some conversation along the way about not just if BMS still wants to do the deal, but do we as a small company want to move forward with this deal? Because that could have been up to us. We could have decided to walk away as well at that time, right? The deal was not signed. So we did have some of that discussion as well, but the discussion ended up, of course, steering us towards getting the deal done, and the collaboration went through the 5 years, and clinical data was generated, and time will tell how that program turns out.
And then so Seismic came next, of course, and has led on to where you are today. And then looking back over, I suppose, your career to date, from working in biotech, working in an academic research group, into big pharma, biotechs again, machine learning driven company. And you shared some of them already, but what have been the sort of other key career lessons, do you think, that you've taken from your experience over the years that you'd share with people?
I would say for me, another learning was how to have the appropriate level of humility and confidence, because I do think this is obviously a business that's very challenging. It's a high risk, high reward type of situation. You never know where the science is going to take you. Some of the science can be very exciting and may or may not work out. And so I think, especially here at Seismic, where we work on the immune system, I think there's a humility there about knowing that we don't understand everything about how the immune system works. And for me, I think it's also that in my career, I've learned about business development along the way. We touched upon it earlier. I, along the way, did not do an MBA. I still don't have one. Probably never will at this point. But I've learned as I went along, if you will, and I'm still learning a lot, right? So I think every role that I've had, I've learned something about myself, but also something about the industry, something about, a particular maybe realm that I had not yet been accountable for. In my job at Akena, for instance, when we went public, we needed a warm body, if you will, to write the business section of our S1. Right. And, I decided that I could do it. I'd never done it before. And, we were able to successfully go through our IPO process. So I sort of feel like every role that I have is really about being confident enough to volunteer and step up when you're needed to do certain things, but yet be humble enough to know that you don't know everything and you need to ask questions, and that there's always more to learn. But that's a sometimes a hard line to kind of walk between humility and confidence. But I think if you can blend both together, you can be a very successful executive.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned this earlier, and I do want to ask you a little bit more about it. The step into that C-level position, and sort of taking that broader perspective about the company as opposed to just what you're doing, or your division. People, I suppose, sometimes see it as a linear transition, but I think even when it is, it can be quite a big jump into that executive team, in terms of what's expected of you and the level at which you have to operate and that kind of thing. So, what have been your experiences of that, and what advice might making that step?
Yeah, I mean, I would say for me, there's always been a desire to lead, and I think that's something that as a
Right.
C-level executive you do across the company. So you're responsible, of course, for your own remit at the end of the day, but my personal goals are the corporate goals, and so
Mm,
it takes a while when you're going from individual contributor to a C-level executive to I think start realizing that at the end of the day, you're responsible for everything that happens here at the company, right? You and the other C-level executives, as corny as it sounds, you are all in this together,
right.
and that is the truth. And I think if you find great collaborators here at Seismic, we have a terrific, very diverse team, and I think we work very well together and bring our own perspectives to the table, and I think it makes us stronger as a team. You can accomplish a lot by having this enterprise leadership. We have abilities to mentor people across the company, and I think that's very important. And I do think that being an enterprise leader is how you can be very successful as a C-level executive. And so, as much as you're responsible for business development or financing or whatever
Mm,
is in your remit, I think I see my responsibility across the company. I'm here to enable the science at the end of the day, right? Like BD is a support function. Science is the way that we
right.
generate value. Science is the way that we were going to help patients. And so I'm here to enable the science. And so for me, that also means mentoring scientists as needed here
Hmm.
at the company. And that's something that I really enjoy. And I would say, I read an interesting book as well when I was transitioning from being an individual contributor to a C-level executive. I think it's called something like "What Got You Here Won't Get You There," by
Yeah,
Marshall
yeah, yeah. I
Goldsmith.
know.
I think it's a fairly classic
Hmm.
management type book, and that one was really helpful because I did have to let go of certain things that maybe made me a very successful individual
Yes.
contributor to become a successful C-level executive. I can no longer be involved in everything. I can't do everything myself. So, there needs to be trust. There needs to be delegation, to members of my team in order for them to execute. And my job now is really to engage them, motivate them. There's still obviously a few things that I continue to do myself, but it's a very different flavor of leadership when you're at the C-level versus an individual contributor.
Yes. Yeah, of course. And I think you're right. I think that's the most challenging part, is leaving those bits behind that have made you successful, right? Because there's a lot of often a lot of anxiety associated with moving away from those things, because they are the things that have got you where you are. So it can be a real challenge.
Yeah, I see myself much more now as, I would say, a sounding board, a cheerleader, right? I can
Hmm.
be who my team wants me to be.
Yeah.
Right. I think this goes back to this adaptability comment we discussed earlier as well. I do think that you have to be able to recognize what various people need, whether they're in your team or across the company, in order to be successful. And that might look different depending on who that person is, depending on their background, the stage of their career that they're at. And so, I think depending on what they need, I can definitely adapt and be there for them in any way that is needed.
Yes. And so this may be something you've already touched on, but if you were to give one piece of advice to a young Maud, perhaps leaving Toronto and coming down to Boston, one thing that maybe you know now that you wish you knew then, what would that be?
I think there's a couple of them that we touched upon that we can expand on a little bit more. The first one is
Hmm.
definitely around creating opportunities for yourself. We've talked about
Yes.
how I landed my first BD gig, and I think being proactive about your career is key. You can definitely, I think, manage to make transitions in your career and maybe have opportunities come your way that would not have happened otherwise. And I think there's also an opportunity there to be open-minded because you're putting yourself out there. There might
Yeah.
actually be opportunities that come up that you hadn't planned for that might be better path for you. And so for me, I think I had always a longer term goal of being a business development executive in a high science kind of environment, as we talked about. But it's not as if I had a very specific career plan in terms of the sequence of steps I was going to take and what kind of organizations I was going to be a part of. And in some ways, not having a plan was a positive. So,
Yes.
I think sometimes we get too caught up in trying to plan everything, and then we miss out on some opportunities. And so
Yeah.
that would be my first piece of advice.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic.
And the second one is also probably around networking. I mean, I think
Okay.
for any role, but especially in business development, networking is key. And as a scientist, originally, I think most of us are introverts. And so the thought of doing networking is not something that most people are excited about. However,
True.
However, one can train themselves to get to that point. I would say that with time, 20 years in, I'm sort of halfway now between the extrovert to introvert spectrum. And
Hmm.
some of it is finding what works for you and being self-aware enough to know that, let's say, if you've been at a conference for 2 days and you need 2 hours on your own in your hotel room to recharge, then that's okay. If you want to get to know people through volunteering, which is what I've done a lot of in my career, I volunteered for Mass Bio, for instance, for a number of
Hmm.
years. That's a way of networking, right? You get to know different people that aren't necessarily in your sphere on a day-to-day basis, and you get to know them while actually doing something together, whether it's organizing a conference, a panel discussion, a cocktail hour, whatever it is, and you get to know people that way. So I think there's definitely ways that even if you're more of an introvert, you can learn to leverage networking in a good way and perhaps even learn to enjoy it as time
Yes,
goes
yes,
on.
exactly. Or at least pretend.
Right.
Well, Maud,
And
it's
actually,
been.
there's another book I read that was called, I think it was called something like, networking for people who hate networking.
Oh, okay.
And I'm sure there's different variations on that, but for a scientist that likes data and likes information, I've learned a lot of books along the way. And again, some of these hopefully will be helpful reading recommendations for your audience.
Absolutely. That one sounds good. I'm going to pick that one up myself. Well, Maud, it's been fantastic to speak to you. Thank you so much for sharing your story, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun to reminisce about the career path so far and look forward to the future.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe and share it with someone else you think will benefit. And for more podcasts, videos, blogs, and insights, come follow me, Tom Froggatt, on LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, Medium, or TikTok. See you next time.